I chose this slide intentionally. I took it at night at the Bella Center where the Copenhagen conference occurred. I wanted the security guard to pass by so you had some sense of perspective. What this says is this is the size of 1 ton of CO2. Take up the challenge, do everything to change it now. And the day I arrived, you're going to see a pretty shocking slide. I'm going to warn you right now. This almost got released and flew away. By the time the conference was over, it was completely deflated and flat on the ground. I can't think of a better symbol for the hopes, aspirations, and the failures of Copenhagen. I will also tell you, as we talk about influences, let's talk about multinational corporations. Let's talk about ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is responsible for 397 million tons of carbon dioxide being released in the atmosphere. I don't know if you can even picture that, but that is a very significant event. It's not always good to start off a presentation with talking about defining terms, but there are some defining terms I'd like you to consider. If you want to come down front, there's still some seats here. Feel free. The first is this notion of mitigation. Mitigation is what has been emphasized for industrialized countries. How do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for which, let's face it, since the Industrial Revolution, we've built up dramatically. It's the major challenge that we have in the world today. The other is the notion of adaptation. Now, you can have different versions. But what I want to give you about adaptation is the notion of an adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate events. Can you take the impact? How are you going to adjust? So mitigation is technologically, how do you reduce, for want of a better term, your pollution. Adaptation is, how do you adjust? It may seem like a simple term, but if you want to understand the controlling issues that are driving these events, it's these two terms. It's true throughout human history, societies have adapted by adjusting, by altering settlement, agricultural patterns. Let me stress that this is an overly optimistic definition, because sometimes societies have not adapted to climate change and variation, and they died. One of the great, I think one of the best books is a book by Joseph Tainter, Oxford University Press. It's called The Collapse of Complex Societies. That theme was taken up in a book by Jared Diamond, which I strongly recommend to you, called Collapse. And you will see this issue taken up again and again about how people do or do not adapt to climatic variation. There's some of you, and I'm seeing some students here who I had the privilege of working in the genocide seminar. You can make a very valid argument that happened in Rwanda, where 1 million people died in 100 days, was a result of climatic impact and struggle for natural resources, leading to some very violent and horrifying outcomes. Now, the final issue is this notion of capacity. Capacity is the ability to adapt. Do you have the strength? I mean, I can give some examples. The nation state that I worry most about on the face of the earth is Bangladesh, because it doesn't have the ability to adapt to some horrifying changing climatic conditions. When you look at the Outer Banks, for example, of the Carolinas, you say, why do people build there? Gorgeous place, but it gets wiped out by hurricanes, but we can rebuild. You could also ask yourself the question, why have we gone back and done the same patterns in New Orleans in terms of building and reconstruction in the face of a horrible natural catastrophe when we could have changed everything? Part of it's our culture, our history, our tradition, but we have to think differently. There's going to be some very bleak assessments here. I'm going to end on a positive note, so stay optimistic with me. What happened in Copenhagen? It was history in the making. It was years in the preparation. I was very excited about going. I was very excited about being the head of an NGO delegation of one, which was Salve Regina University, by the way. But it was 2 weeks of negotiation that came down to the wire, and we didn't cross the wire. It was a colossal carbon footprint. Before I arrived, I only came in the second week because I wanted to be somewhat frugal. I knew that the last things would happen in the second week. By the time I had arrived, there was no more room for corporate or private jets. Many times during the day, the airport closed down. The limousines, 5,000 limousines in Denmark were gone. They had to import limousines for this conference from Sweden. France sent 57 official delegates. Every single one of those delegates had a private car. This is a conference on climate change. And I thought, what are we doing? Now, don't worry, I took public transport, and it was really good. But I thought, this is astounding. It was a zoo. I stayed in Sweden, one, because it was cheaper, and two, I suspected Copenhagen would be a disaster, and I was right. I was so sick of the riots and the arrests and the UN buses and transportation never arrived or were just canceled. I just wanted some sanity, and I was lucky to be able to transport back and forth between Sweden. And in the end, it was a political agreement of 12 paragraphs. At the same time, after years of preparation, it may seem like a colossal disappointment. Yeah, it was disappointing, but it was not a failure. Let me come back to the example of Senator Pell. He was not uncritical of the United Nations, but I swear to God, he was more supportive of international dialogue and multilateral understanding than any U.S. senator we ever had. You don't realize this, you've heard me say it before, some of you, but every day he served on the floor of the U.S. Senate, he carried a copy of the UN Charter inside his suit jacket. That's the kind of idealistic belief he had. And I would argue the UN did what it does best. It's not an action for great decision making, but it provides a forum for debate, declaration, and dialogue. I'll give you an example. On the second to last day, I had to walk through this protest. These were people protesting for the state of Ogaden. How many have ever heard of Ogaden? Yeah, me too. I said, what is this all about? You notice their signs are in Norwegian? It turns out that Ogaden is the largest state, southeastern state of Ethiopia. And it's a Somali community. These are Somali expatriates protesting. And when I did a little bit of research, since they were quite passionate and I had to walk right through them, I didn't want to get them upset. I said, what are they upset about? They had a very specific protest. They were protesting about the president of the state they live in, Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, selling out the African Union. He was the lead negotiator for $10 billion a year in assistance in 2 degrees Celsius as limiting the total level of global climate change. Because what came out of this agreement was 2 degrees Celsius, anything over that is a death sentence for the planet. It's catastrophic. Unfortunately, 2 degrees Celsius doesn't mean it's level around the globe. Africa is already suffering immense impacts from climate change. And 2 degrees Celsius, some suggest, would translate during this century to 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius change, which would be devastating. Now get ready for this one. It's going to be a shocking slide, but this is what I saw when I first arrived and I got off the subway. I'd walk into the Bellows Center to register. All of you know the statement by Marie Antoinette when the peasants were revolting about let them eat cake. Okay, well I got off the subway and here's the first thing I saw. I thought, oh boy. As it turns out, I couldn't register because they had broken into the Bellows Center, shut down the whole conference. It closed and wanted to hold the People's Congress. I will admit I had bad timing. But this was Agricultural Farm Day. And as I sit back a couple of weeks later, I'm trying to reflect on exactly what happened, what we did or didn't do there. And I end up actually being rather angry. Because this is a statement, abolish capitalism, that's never really going to get any traction on the international landscape, but it can shut down an international conference when you're trying to make progress. So it was a frustration the whole week. I saw police beating back crowds. I saw people being arrested, flattened on the floor. And I thought to myself, you know, people have a right to protest, but we have our lives in the balance. And we need better perspective. Denmark was not prepared for this. So it was white noise and dancing polar bears. Because when I finally got into the center, Oxfam International, which has these, I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They did this in Bali. The dancing polar bears who run around with signs that say, save the humans too. Interesting dynamic. I showed this video clip from Oxfam's website, which seems totally silly and ridiculous, and it is. But it's getting across a point in trying to reach an audience. I would suggest a younger audience about how you can change the future. So let me play this brief clip. This is Mr. Green.
Hello, welcome back again to the Oxfam CCTV. I'm Mr. Green. This is my day, and I hope you had a nice weekend. I did. I was in the streets with some of the Oxfam delegation and another 100,000 people marching the streets of Copenhagen for the big demo. It was fantastic. It was amazing to see how many people can unite and raise their voice at the same time with a clear message. I'm going to start out now introducing you to some furry friends of mine that you might have met before. They were represented at the negotiations in Bali 2 years ago, and now they're here back in Copenhagen to deliver a clear message saying that save humans too. So let's see how our furry friends did earlier.
We're just doing to tell the world there are just 5 days left. 5 days to save this planet, to save human beings. There are millions of people who are dying every day. Every minute there are thousands of people suffering because of climate change. And it's high time our leaders realize this and take action. We don't want flippant documents. We want a legally binding and ambitious deal that will save this planet, that will help poor people, millions of poor people across the world, the north and the south. Give us a deal, and we want a deal now so that we can save lives. Remember, delay kills.
Save humans too. Save humans too. Save humans too. That's right, polar bears. That's the spirit. You gotta save some lives, and you gotta save some humans as well as animals. Get that right. All right, now, back to negotiations, serious stuff. As you might have heard, the negotiations were suspended earlier today. It seems like it has been resumed, and let's hear it from...
This is the day I arrived when the negotiations were suspended.
So today,
at the UN summit in Copenhagen, it's been another day of drama. We've had a situation where the Africa group have basically asked for a suspension of the talks. This comes really as an expression of the frustration and anger of developing countries at the unwillingness of rich countries to genuinely start to negotiate about the reductions in their carbon dioxide pollution through the Kyoto Protocol. And what's happened today is an expression of really the anger that's come from watching, as a developing country, 2 years of brinkmanship by rich countries, an unwillingness to come forward with finance figures for long-term financing for poorer countries, both adaptation and mitigation, and an unwillingness to really negotiate on the reduction of rich countries' own pollution.
Thank you very much, Joe. All right, tomorrow, a very important day. Oxfam is hosting the first ever international climate hearing. It's going to be inside the conference center. It's going to drag a lot of mass media attention. There will be a lot of people listening to climate witnesses' stories from all over the world. Stories about how climate change already affects human beings, their lives, in their communities, in their countries. Of course, we're going to be there and bring you some of those stories and bring you verdicts from that trial. As for now, I don't have much else to say. I'm going to leave you with a little game that I call Spotting a Climate Celebrity.
It's really hard. Just love back on the USA.
I want to step back and talk about the perspectives of the various negotiating positions here. This is a term I use every once in a while, but I think it's actually quite valid here, a mental map. We all have them. We can't operate without a mental map. I, in particular, ask myself, is my mental map correct all the time? Because how you draw that map, how you see the world subtly but vitally determines how you act in that world. This is what I would say single-handedly stopped progress. For example, here's what we look, an actual composite image of the world, but it really becomes interesting when you turn out the lights. Let's look at the difference between the United States of America, for example, which is 30% of the gross domestic product, 5% of the population, and 20% of the carbon emissions on the face of the planet. You go over to China, which is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but you see it's pretty unevenly distributed. The eastern section of China is real intensity. Look at the difference between India and Pakistan. In fact, I defy you to show me where Pakistan is. It's in the dark. Look at the difference between the 38th parallel between North and South Korea. If you look it up closely, you could see Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, but everything else is in the dark. But the one that really scares me is this one. We're talking 750 million people, 2% of the gross domestic product on this planet, and the people who may hurt the most as a result of climatic variation. Using this template, I want to go through 12 different actors. The first, you may be surprised, is OPEC. But OPEC has demanded that if there's reduction in fuel prices, that they need some compensation. And they can affect oil prices as a result of that. It may not be a large in terms of emissions, and you may be surprised that it's so small in terms of GDP, but they are international players. Another player reversing it is the Rainforest Coalition. It's a group of particular states, and you will notice strikingly that Brazil is not a member of the Rainforest Coalition. But it's basically 30 states that have an interest in compensation for their forest. One of the actual positive outcomes, and you will see me refer to this later on, is the REDD, the Rainforest Emission Deforestation and Degradation Agreement. There is movement on this. So that's one good thing that happened. Notice it's also almost 20% of the population. Now here's something that's interesting, the small island states. 1% of emissions, 1% of GDP, and 1% of people. Why do you think I'd even bother to put this on here? Well, the reason is because these are the people on the face of the planet who will suffer and indeed maybe disappear as a result of climate change. The small Pacific island nation of Tuvalu, for example, has an agreement with New Zealand, a national security agreement that in the event of sea level rise, all of their citizens will be repatriated in New Zealand because their island will disappear. Maldives is part of this. So you could say they have small bargaining power, but the thing about the United Nations is that everyone has a voice. And that small island nation of Tuvalu certainly made its roar heard at the Copenhagen conference. Very interesting group of which China claims to be nominally representative. It was actually, their lead speaker was an ambassador from Sudan, Ambassador Opping, Lumumba Opping, G77, which is 130 states, founded in 1964 among a number of UN groups such as the G20, the G7. This is starting to look like what the planet is. But here's the distinction. Look at this. 76% of the people, but 19% of the gross domestic product. Remember the United States? 5% of people, 30% of the gross domestic product. This is where the resentment and the distaste for the industrialized, wealthy nations come from the so-called emerging or majority states. What did 2 degrees mean? 2 degrees and $10 billion a year for those prospective these states. Here's what the leader of the G77 representative said. This is an interview with Naomi Klein, the Canadian, some would say radical journalist, but it's a brief interview to hear this perspective.
Very clear about many things, but
what have I done?
2 things that I want to bring out now are what 2 degrees in Africa, that would be 3 to 3.5 degrees, which would translate into the deaths of tens of millions of people. He's also been very clear about the level of financing that's on the table. He described the $10 million on offer, $10 million a year, as being not enough money to buy the coffins to bury us. Yet yesterday, Meles Zenawi was in Paris, and he agreed to a deal saying that it was on behalf of Africa that agreed to the 2-degree increase in temperatures and agreed to that $10 billion a year. So I think everybody is very curious to hear your reaction.
Well, my reaction is a simple one. Meles Zenawi, the Prime Minister, like many African leaders, has not done the independent analysis to know really what does 2 degrees Celsius. So he erred on 3 counts. Not doing the work necessary to make that policy decision. Second, not consulting those Africans who voice their concerns about what's happening. And the third one, not looking at the holistic approach to the question of climate change. He has taken a narrow approach, basically the so-called fast-track approach, which centers around what happens in the next 3 years rather than going deep into the fundamentals. Climate change represents the most dangerous and the gravest risk we have. You cannot deal with it from a narrow perspective. You have to really look at the fundamentals. You have to look at its implications in their totality, rather than a narrow approach.
So what can we do now within the G77? Is close down options for you in the negotiations?
at all. On the contrary, it actually enriches and enables us to focus the debate on what is critical. As you know, I have been speaking to many African leaders, among them Bishop Desmond Tutu, who had the humility to say, I never thought this could happen this day in the world. So to that extent, I do believe that there's more than an opportunity to persuade him to step back and rethink and reflect deeply on these issues and the policies he has accepted, or the wisdom he accepted.
So that's the perspective of the leader of the G77. Meles Zenawi, as I mentioned before, is the president of Ethiopia, but was also representing the African Union. Basically what the African Union under Zenawi, and remember those people from Ogaden were protesting against him, 13% of the people, 3% of emissions, they were accepting about $10 billion in aid from the developed world for the next 3 years, and a global target of 2 degrees. The ambassador was suggesting that 2 degrees was a death sentence because it could translate to 3 to 3.5 degrees in Africa. The other 2 major powers emerging, Brazil and India, both resisted some climate targets, but India did finally admit to shooting for a 20 to 25% reduction by the year 2020, and Brazil could be cooperative. The former Soviet republics, not huge in terms of emissions, people, or GDP, but a lot of former Soviet republics, particularly in Central Asia, did and do rely on mechanisms from the Kyoto Protocol for climate-friendly projects. It's a great form of foreign investment. The European Union looks pretty dinky up there, but it's a major player. 15% of emissions, 25% of GDP, 8% of people. And it's probably the most progressive bloc on the face of the planet in terms of actually meeting Kyoto Protocol's reduction targets and moving into the future. The European Union is also pretty aggressive on those who don't make reduction targets, being fined hugely financially. The Annex 1 states, this is from the '97 Kyoto Protocol. These are the players in the bloc. 19% of people, 75% of gross domestic product, 51% of emissions. Notably, Australia, the United States, Canada are not players in this. President Clinton, of course, approved the Kyoto Protocol, but the Senate refused to ratify it. Canada, under Prime Minister Harper, has withdrawn, and Australia is not a player. The United States, this is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We are a major player. Maybe small in terms of population, but we're huge in terms of money. We're huge in terms of emissions. I would suggest that we, the United States, and the People's Republic of China were the 2 big failures and stopped anything from happening at at Copenhagen. China is now the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Its economy is up and coming, and it's 20% of people. And they just refuse to allow inspections, refuse transparency. They had emission reduction targets, but they were tied to per capita growth income, which is highly dependent. So the final video, I promise you, but as some of you well know, I was a consultant on Earth 2100, the final century of civilization. And this particular video clip is a war game that was played, which is an incredible precursor to what happened at Copenhagen. And sadly, that's game turned out to be deadly accurate because in 2009, December in Copenhagen, that's exactly what stopped everything from making progress. The large developing states, China, India, and Brazil, wanted money and technology transfer, which the developed states were unwilling to give. Just look at this image. This is President Obama on the last day, 15 December. China kept on sending lower representatives to the meetings when heads of state were supposed to be. He actually had to go down to a meeting room to find Wen Jiabao. He had to go down to a meeting room to find Wen Jiabao to have a meeting with him because he was meeting with European leaders. And the President of the United States is standing in the hallway saying, Mr. Premier, are you ready to see me? Are you ready? Take a look at the body language. President Obama is leaning over, hands out, saying these are the opportunities. Wen Jiabao is closed in, his hands are crossed, and he has a look on his face and said, tell me what your name is again? It says it all. So here's what happened out of those 12 paragraphs. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. No argument. But we have common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. We should keep the global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. Beyond that, it could be a global catastrophe. We need to establish a comprehensive adaptation program. As the fourth assessment, which I worked on, we need to reduce global emissions to hold that global increase below 2 degrees. However, we recognize that adaptation is difficult for all countries, especially developed, for least developed countries, small island states, developing states in Africa. So developed countries should, but not must, provide predictable, sustainable financial resources. And Annex 1 parties, which I showed you before from the 1997, Kyoto Protocol, should implement economy-wide emission targets for 2020, submitted a few days from now. Non-Annex 1 parties, emerging states, will implement mitigation actions due a few days from now. There are positive incentives. I mentioned about the Rainforest Coalition. This is a good thing that happened, the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, to essentially provide financial incentives for the preservation of rainforest and areas that are great, for want of a better term, sucking pools for carbon dioxide, since that's what these forests are. Use market opportunities to enhance cost effectiveness and to promote mitigation. In the next 3 years, 2010 to 2012, there should be $10 billion a year in aid. As you heard the representative of the G77, that's nowhere near enough. And to establish a Copenhagen Green Climate Fund to monitor these actions. Secretary Clinton came on Thursday the 14th and announced that the United States would lead the effort to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries, with no specific action plan as to how that could possibly be done. I know inflation is an issue, but $100 billion is a lot of money. Funding will come from a wide variety of sources, to be discussed later. And so we need to reassess this process. Michelle, how are we doing on time? 6:45? Would you allow me a few more minutes? A couple more slides, because I want to step back. I'm going to skip through some slides, but I want to just place a couple of things in context about how serious this issue is. When I talk about security, and that's what my background is, I ask these simple questions. For whom, from whom, by whom, with what means. Now, I will skip this slide. Got that? When we talk about security, it stems from the Latin securitas, which really translates as lack of care. You could also say freedom from worry, which is a wonderful state that we'd all love to be in, but we never get there. But the concept becomes contested since through its application, increasing security in one way may lessen it for others. Providing security for one group may render other groups less secure. And I hope you're seeing this by this constant repetition of the various points of perspective. So here's two things. First, the practice, or if you prefer praxis of security, should be understood as extreme efforts within a state to manage uncertainty. And second, you have to incorporate in planning and design environmental aspects if you're talking about a state and security, especially in the 21st century. I'm going to give you some very specific examples. Let's talk about this. Extreme efforts within a state's larger management. We know, for example, the second half of the 20th century was the warmest in the last 500 years. And it actually, if it had not been for human influenced forces, it probably would have been resulting in cooling, not warming. We're going to have some severe effects. Increased coral bleaching, increased water resources, increased drought, and increased coastal damage. I'm going to skip these slides. Actually, I want to go back to this last slide. This is from the third assessment report, and this is also reported from the Hadley Center. These are climatic variations that could occur in the 21st century. The problem for scientists is this is various scenarios that reflect climatic differences. For a policymaker, this will drive you insane. Because the difference between 1 degree Celsius rise and almost 5 degrees Celsius rise is the life and death of millions of people. And if you can't know with certainty, how are you supposed to act? How are you supposed to use your resources? It's the same with various scenarios that were in the third assessment report for temperature and sea level rise. Whole nation states may disappear as a result of the difference in here. But on science, it's possible. Policymakers want definite answers. So I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities. Vulnerability is not a direct threat. It's an indication of something going wrong, and that's what climate change relate to. It's not clearly perceived, it's not well understood, and it's a source of contention. And I'm going to give you some examples. The most dangerous thing, and climate change is a beautiful example of this, given long-term vulnerability, the frequent mistake of the decision maker is to do nothing at all because it's too hard to think about. In simple terms, vulnerability analysis examines how disruption, degradation, or destruction might arise by a different set of potential harms. Let me give you an example. Canada. Canada's Northwest Passage is becoming increasingly navigable. So what? Well, it's a huge deal. It's kind of what you've heard me say before, the miracle of the 21st century. Because the distance in terms of shipping from Europe to Asia is 8,400 kilometers shorter than transiting the Panama Canal. That's huge. But at the same time, it's not a canal. It is a huge Arctic passageway. It's still fragile. You can have illicit smuggling, human trafficking, you can have disasters at sea. And it's all based on a vulnerability of no one knows how much sea levels will rise, what temperatures will be, and how much those levels will fluctuate. Based on that, you're supposed to make a decision about the future. This is why vulnerabilities are so negative and positive at the same time. At the same time, there's a race to the north. Canada, now we know, is the second largest source of diamonds in the world. It rivals Saudi Arabia for shale oil deposits. It's huge in terms of potential natural resources. I would also note that Senator Pell was a leading proponent of the international law of the sea treaty, which the United States of America has not yet signed. And unless we do, we will have no rights in the north. So all these things are interrelated. Population growth, climate change. It's not a climate problem. It's not a disease problem. It's not a food problem. It's a human problem. And we have it. They all act on each other. Proposition 2, environment, planning, design, and use are fundamental aspects of the state's response. And when you don't think about it, you're going to get in trouble. Here's a picture of the period of over 20 years, from 1979 to, I believe, it is 2000? It is 2000, of the melting of the Arctic Greenland ice sheet. As a result of that, the terrible thing is abrupt climate change. It may be a small probability, but hugely catastrophic event. Okay, it's only between 5 and 10%, but again, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggests all bets are off in the 21st century. Here's the state I worry about most in the world. Since the 1950s, up to 17 million Bangladeshis have migrated to India because of natural disasters. Half of Bangladesh lies just above sea level, and it faces the future loss of large areas of coastline due to flooding and sea level rise. Let me also stress that Bangladesh is sinking, and it's more related to agricultural overuse than it is to climatic variation. It's literally sinking into the Bay of Bengal. With the melting of the Himalayan ice sheet and the rising of the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, Bangladesh is either drowning or it's suffering from drought. It's the worst of all possible worlds. India in 2007 completed a 4,000 kilometer, 3-meter high barrier as a result of potential outcomes. That's what it looks like. And imagine this as your daily commute. Oh, let me go back here because I want you to see that. I don't know what happened. I guess it's gone. It's a pretty horrifying image. Do humans cause earthquakes? This is a very sensitive issue, but as a result of impacts. I grew up in Australia, and the city where I lived, 1989, was flattened. Newcastle as a result of mining. A lot of scientists will disagree with what I'm about to say, but last summer, I was in Sichuan, China, and came across evidence with a colleague that presented from Columbia University at our NATO conference this last summer, that indeed the horrible Sichuan earthquake of 2008, 8.0 magnitude, 80,000 people dead, 5 million displaced, was caused by the result of building of a dam that was too close to the epicenter. Evidence is there has not been this kind of activity of such intensity for millions of years. The effect was 25 times more than a year's worth of natural stress from tectonic movement. This is what it looked like right after the quake. The Chinese military had sealed the area off, so I hiked up into the hills, and this is the picture I took of a necropolis of Sichuan. Over 1 million people, and no one can live here now. And you can see, you can raise the hair on your arms, you can see the fault line running right through the middle of the city. I'm showing this as an example of human impacts, and also consider your impact, power of 32. I don't know if you realize it, but as a member of the developed world and the highest carbon emitter in the United States and China, we consume resources and produce waste about 32 times higher in the developed world than in the majority world. This is one of the reasons why if the rest of the world consumed energy the way we do in the United States, we'd need 6 planet Earths to just sustain ourselves. If India and China were to catch up with the developed world, world consumption would triple. We can't do that. Living standards are not tightly coupled to consumption because US oil consumption is twice that of Western Europe, yet Western Europe's standard of living is higher in life expectancy, infant mortality, medical care, retirement security, vacation time, quality of public school, support for the arts. We have serious consumption problems. We have to ask ourselves, how are we going to deal with this? Because we are part of the problem. Military considerations. Some of you remember Admiral Frank Bowman, who presented here. He was on this panel that presented in 2007, testified before Congress that climate change could have a serious human impact. I don't know if you realize it, that when Pensacola was shut down, it closed for over a year. When fleets suffer major storms, they put out to sea. We have a lot of ports for our Navy forces in the South, and if you can see increasing damage, we're going to have to move. This tiny little island owned by Great Britain is a huge hub, but it could disappear, and it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Some positive examples. And yes, I'm actually going to end this presentation. I'm not saying I'm always pro-European, but I would say the Europeans have some good ideas. And I would say the Scandinavians, as usual, lead the way. Denmark. Let's talk about some of the things they're doing. Now, I'm not saying Denmark is a saint, because they use over 50% of their resource energy from electricity, coal for generation. So that's a big no-no, but they have done some good things. It is a welfare state, high taxes, but it uses income to stimulate innovation and promotes positive cycling. If you can do it better, faster, and cleaner, then you'll be rewarded. If you don't, you'll be punished in terms of taxes. Since 1990, it's reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 14%, yet its GDP has grown by more than 40%. It's the most energy efficient country in the EU due to carbon pricing, energy taxes, carbon taxes, cap and trade, strict building codes. And it puts only, this is really interesting, and I'm going to show you another example from Sweden, 3% of its waste into landfills. And incinerates 39% to generate electricity, mostly through biomass for households. Wind power is huge. 20% of their energy comes from wind power in Denmark. Not a great slide. I took this from the train from Sweden to Denmark, but I thought you'd want to see. You know, hundreds and hundreds of these sitting out in the sea. Where I stayed in Malmö, Sweden, was really inspiring. Now, Sweden is no saint either. Sweden uses more nuclear energy per capita because the population is small than any other state in the face of the planet. France, of course, is a huge nuclear power, but I found this fascinating. I was there in the middle of some nasty snowstorms, and 40% of the population commutes by bicycle, and they really did this in snowstorms. I said, this is nuts. They're serious about it. I visited this wonderful place. I'm going to show you some slides. Winter Harbor. It's Sweden's first climate-neutral city district. It supplies 100% renewable energy to residents. And its energy is from solar, wind, and heat pumps that extract from seawater. Quite a variance. You can see the solar panels. They're aquifers that take seawater in and pump heat through pumps to these highly intensive areas. And there's a huge architectural variation in this wonderful section of the city. It can be pretty exclusive, yet you can see this is pretty bohemian, but actually that's just a wonderful residence. Here's the senior citizen housing, which is defined at 55 or older. I was ready to sign up pretty fast. Fascinating building, a little frightening. This is the symbol of Malmo. It's called the turning torso. One of the reasons why I show the turning torso is because it's a business center and there are 147 apartments in this building. And every single one of those apartments in its garbage disposal takes the sludge, brings it down to a biomass generator in the bottom of the building to produce biomass. It's recycling waste. It's truly fascinating. Now, here's my favorite example. No, this is not made by Alcoa aluminum. This is a radiant-free house. This is Sweden we're talking about. It was 20 below there. There are no radiators in this building. It's household appliances and human body heat that heat the entire inside of that building. That is just really awesome. 100% organic food, grown locally, served in schools by 2012. This is the Surge Park, which is also an apartment in a psychiatric hospital. That's a huge photovoltaic plant. They're also working on there at the site, not done yet, installing a pretty impressive Stirling generator. This is a wind turbine. You need no permission to install this. It costs you about 10,000 euros, and it can produce electricity for your house. It's just simple little measures like that, which I think are so impressive. And here's one of their hydrogen cars for the city. So, in conclusion, yeah, it was a disappointment, but I'll say it's not a failure. And UN did what it does best. It's a place for us to talk. We have a lot of work to do. Of course, I want to end with this. I don't know how many of you remember the horrible Columbia disaster of 2003, when a piece of foam tile hit the shuttle on launch. But the next launch of that was in 2005, and the same thing happened. The Discovery was up in space. They didn't know if they were going to come back. The same thing was going to happen. And I was really, really struck by this statement I think we need to keep in mind. Eileen Collins, the commander whom I knew, you can see how there is erosion and how it's deforestation. Very widespread in some parts of the world. The atmosphere almost looks like an eggshell on an egg. It's so very thin. We know we don't have much air. We need to protect what we have. Of course, you could always take option 2. Let's hope we don't. Thank you very much.